If the blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was the gravest ecological act of terrorism in our lifetime, then the flooding caused by the blowing of the Kakhovka Dam is up there, certainly in the Premier League class of ecological, environmental disasters. There are a lot of idiots around, but not as many as there used to be. Truthfully, there are far more people employed to try and fool the remaining idiots that are still abroad, but they are having less and less success. And you will see that from the result of the poll that we are running tonight. Who blew up the Kakhovka Dam? A, Russia. B, Ukraine. 25,000 people have already voted in this poll, and I have only just begun the show. It's already the biggest poll we've ever run, and it's set to go higher yet. And the results are completely overwhelming, except on Twitter, where the NATO support base got busy all day trying to influence the outcome of this vote, which tells us something important. Because of that 25,000, only 7,000 were on Twitter, and 60% on that poll on Twitter blamed Russia. So that, by my reckoning, is fewer than 4,000 votes. So fewer than 4,000 people think it was Russia, or at least pretend to think it was Russia that blew up the dam. That means that more than 20,000 people in this poll so far blame Ukraine. I'll return to the issue of information, misinformation, disinformation later in the show, because it is emerging as the most crucial battlefield of them all. So there are idiots, but there are fewer of them. And even some of the people you might think are idiots are actually on the payroll in one way or another. So, eat it up, losers. You have lost this poll in a landslide. Not that you'll know it, because most of you are AI. That's right. We'll be talking about bots and AI later in the show also. If you were to be stupid enough to believe that Russia blew up their own dam under their control, flooding their own battle lines, making possible an amphibious assault across what were just a day or two ago solid defensive lines, if you were stupid enough to believe that the Russians flooded their own people in territory that they control, put at risk a nuclear power plant in danger of meltdown because it's water cooled, if you are stupid enough to believe that Russia deliberately cut off the water supply of their own people in Crimea, then you are truly stupid indeed. You may even be in Ward 5 in Broadmoor. Because to believe it, you'd have to believe that the Russians were systematically sabotaging, self-harming, suiciding their own people and their own assets. You'd have to believe that the Russians blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, except nobody believes that anymore. Most people believe Seymour Hersh, who'll be a guest on this show quite soon, God willing, that the Americans blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Or you can believe the mainstream intelligence service mouthpieces like the New York Times and the Washington Post, who say that America has concluded that Ukraine blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, the gravest environmental act of terrorism in history, I remind you. The Americans say that Zelensky's regime did it. Who will hold them accountable if that is even true? What will be the price paid? We already know the price paid by the European gas consumer. We already know the price paid by European industry in the European unemployment lines. We already know that. But is anybody going to hold Zelensky to account for an act of terrorism, the second biggest act of terrorism, and arguably in the long term, an even more grave act of terrorism than 9/11 itself, the gravest act of terrorism in Europe ever perpetrated against civilian infrastructure? You'd have to believe that the Russians did that to themselves, and nobody now believes that. You'd have to believe that the Russians flew their own drone into their own Kremlin, into the residence of the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. But nobody any longer believes that. If you are still amongst those who believe that, you are truly an idiot. And if you previously believed it, but have now begun to doubt it, you need to ask yourself why you are regularly, systematically fooled by the next thing. The next thing that's twibboned on Twitter. The next thing that is force-fed to you by a mainstream media which has given up even pretending that it is other than a mouthpiece for its own regime and the alliance regimes of which they form part of a network. You'd have to believe that the Russians really are cannibalizing washing machines for military spare parts. You'd have to believe that a woman leant out of a window in Kiev and really did throw a tin of tomatoes at a Russian drone and destroy it in front of her eyes. You'd have to believe that the ghost of Kiev really was real. You'd have to believe that somebody in Bucha, in the Russian armed forces, decided to conduct a massacre amongst Russian supporting people wearing white armbands to signify their support for Russian-speaking people. In other words, if you believe that Russia blew up the Kakhovka Dam, there's no hope for you, and you are here expelled from the hallowed halls of this global university. Now, as I said in the opener, the American Navy is sailing more ships around China than it is around its own coast. So is the British Navy. Not that our Navy is much to speak of these days. So is the navies of the European Union countries that were ordered by somebody called Joseph Borrell, who calls himself the foreign minister of the EU, although nobody ever elected him to any position in the European Union. He calls himself the foreign minister, and he has called on the members of the EU to send their navies to the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, because he says that is freedom's frontier. This is a European Union that cannot even guard its own coasts. Britain, among them, doesn't even try to guard the English Channel, across which come scores of thousands of illegal immigrants by boat every year, quite unintercepted by the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy is in the South China Sea. The Royal Navy is in the Straits of Taiwan. The Royal Navy is patrolling freedom's frontier in China. And the Americans had the gall to claim that a Chinese naval ship came too close to them when they were sailing a hair's breadth from China and 8,600 miles away from the United States of America itself. We'll be talking to the most famous European living in China since Marco Polo, coming up in the show in the second hour on that. Now, AI is fast becoming one of the most important stories of them all. I decided to take a closer interest in it. It never really grabbed me much before. I didn't see a science fiction film from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I saw in 1975, I think, I never saw one between then and until quite recently. It doesn't, as a subject, a genre, really interest me. But then I saw a report that a Ukrainian drone, which was told by its master, its controller, to abort its mission, turned tail and tried to attack its controller in a fury that it had not been permitted to carry on and kill Russians. As Lindsey Graham said, the best money we ever spent. The drone thought so too. And so angry was it that it was told to turn back, that it did turn back and tried to stage a kamikaze hit on the person that had told it to turn back. That got me thinking that the wise legal eagle, the greatest wordsmith in the English language, at least on that side of the Atlantic Ocean, Lionel, was right. The AI contains within the greatest peril, short of nuclear war, to the development of human society. And I thought that we in the Open University of the Airwaves should take a deeper dive into it. Now I want to turn to a man that was once a friend of mine. His name is James Cleverly. He is the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. And he said today that Russia had committed a war crime in the bombing of the Kakhovka Dam. This was followed by the European Union Foreign Affairs spokespeople, one after another. Borrell, von der Leyen, and some agency that does their foreign affairs I had never heard of before, all in identical language. So much for Brexit. Huh? It was a carefully coordinated accusation, not only that Russia had committed this act, but that it was a war crime. And if Gordon Brown has his way, it'll be added to the charge sheet and the Interpol warrant they have already got out for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. But as I have already, I hope, persuaded you that only an idiot could believe that the bombing of the dam was a Russian operation, it follows, because although Mr. Cleverly is not most aptly named, he's far from being an idiot. It follows that Mr. Cleverly was lying. This is an important charge I'm making, James. You can, of course, issue suit for libel, if you please. I'm saying that James Cleverly, who is not an idiot, knows very well that Russia did not bomb that dam. And yet today he said they did, and that moreover it constituted a war crime. If this is true, that he told a lie, it was a lie closely followed, shadowed by many other leaders of the Western world. Not all of them. Not the Bild in Germany, for example, that ran a headline blaming Russia and then 1 hour later took the word Russia out of the headline. Not the French, who, together with other aspects of President Macron's foreign policy, is beginning to show more independence of mind than any of the other European Union countries. But one after the other, Western leaders told a brazen lie. Why is that important? After all, most politicians, most of the time, are lying. You can tell that they're lying because their lips are moving. But they're not always lying in such concert, and they're not always lying about matters of such great moment. This means that we in the West are led by a conspiracy. We are led by a conspiracy of liars. We are led by a conspiracy of liars and killers who are ready to kill every last Ukrainian as long as they can keep the Russian war machine occupied and learn from it, sell weapons to their own side, and bring about the destruction of the European Union's own economy. This means we're led by criminals, not fools, but criminals who know the truth but tell the lies. This means we are led by satanic forces who are ready to kill, who are ready to see significant numbers of people die for their lies. Now, this has been true before. It was obviously true in the Iraq War, but it has not been true on such a systematic, concerted basis as we are now experiencing. And the man who said it best said it to the largest television audience ever known just yesterday on Twitter. Tucker Carlson, if he'd still been on Fox News, and if he'd still been getting the audience he got there, which was the biggest audience on Fox News by a country mile, would have spoken it to 3.5 million people on an ordinary weekday. Instead, he spoke it on Elon Musk's Twitter without advertisements, not sponsored by Pfizer or Big Pharma or the military-industrial complex, not sponsored by any commercial entity. No advertisements, no fancy jingles, no graphics. Just Tucker Carlson speaking directly to camera. He is now, I'm being tic-tacked, been watched by in excess of 82 million people in just over 24 hours, a little less than 48 hours to be precise. That's the future of television. Just as satellite meant the end for terrestrial television, just as cable news networks meant the end for most of the mainstream traditional television broadcast outfits, so directly online, like this, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Rumble, on Instagram, everywhere you can get it, is the future of television. Elon Musk paid a lot of money for Twitter, but he has repaid, at least in part, any debt that he had to the rest of us by putting Tucker Carlson in front of what will turn out to be, I hazard a guess, in excess of 100 million people. And he spoke some very important truths. So when you're finished watching the mother of all talk shows, if you have not yet done so, you have to watch Tucker Carlson on Twitter. But stay here meantime, because we've got some cracking guests and, of course, your phone calls over the next 1 hour and 38 minutes. My apologies to my director. I've overrun my monologue by 2 hours and 20 seconds. Stay tuned.